My husband's funeral was supposed to be the lowest point of my life. Rain pelted the cemetery as they lowered his casket, but I couldn't cry anymore. After 3 years of watching cancer steal him away, I was hollow. What I didn't expect was for his mother to grip my arm with her manicured nails and whisper, "Now that he's gone, you can finally leave. You never belonged in this family anyway." I pulled away, remembering David's words just days before he died. "They don't know what's coming, Ellie. Just wait for the will reading." I didn't understand then. My in-laws had spent years making it clear I was temporary, the waitress who somehow trapped their golden boy doctor. They never imagined David had secrets of his own. 3 days later, when the family gathered at the attorney's office, I watched their smug faces transform to horror as David's final message to us all was revealed. That's when I understood exactly what my husband had planned and why he died with that mysterious smile on his face. I met David Harrington at Mercy Hospital in Boston, where I served him coffee every morning during his residency. I was putting myself through nursing school, working double shifts at the hospital cafe. He'd come in looking exhausted, but always left me the kindest notes with his tips. After 3 months of this, he finally asked me out. The Harringtons were Massachusetts aristocracy, old money from shipping and real estate. Their estate in Wellesley had been featured in architectural magazines. Richard Harrington, David's father, was chief of surgery at Boston Memorial, and his mother, Constance, chaired half the charity boards in New England. His younger sister, Audrey, had followed her father into medicine, while his brother James managed the family's investment portfolio. Our first dinner at his parents' home was an Arctic experience. Constance examined my target dress with the same clinical detachment her husband used for biopsies. "Interesting," she said, her smile never reaching her eyes. "David tells us you're from Minnesota. Such quaint little towns out there." What she meant was small, insignificant. My father had been a high school science teacher in Rochester before a heart attack took him when I was 16. Mom worked as a school secretary, scraping to put me through community college before I moved east for better opportunities. During holiday gatherings, they'd speak about their Martha's Vineyard neighbors or prep school connections, while I sat silent, the silverware feeling foreign in my hands. Once, I overheard Richard tell David, "She seems sweet, but honestly, son, there are girls from suitable backgrounds you could settle down with." David defended me, but not strongly enough. "Dad, it's not the 1950s. I love her." "Love fades," Richard answered. "Legacy doesn't." When David proposed anyway, Constance took me aside at our engagement party. "I had the caterer make those little pigs in blankets you people enjoy," she said, sipping her champagne. "David's going through a phase. We'll tolerate it." I almost walked away then, but David promised things would improve. "They'll see what I see in you," he'd said. "Just give them time." After we married, David threw himself into his surgical career, while I finished nursing school. His parents' disdain calcified into something like tolerance. I was acknowledged at family functions, but never truly included. When David made attending physician at 32, Richard gave him their grandfather's Rolex. "Tradition," he'd said meaningfully, avoiding my eyes. The grand gesture came when David was diagnosed at 34. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. Suddenly, I became essential, the caretaker, the wife who could administer his medications and monitor his declining health. The Harringtons descended on our Cambridge townhouse with specialists' numbers and experimental treatment options. "We're taking him to MD Anderson," Richard announced without consulting me. "I've arranged everything." "David's too weak to travel," I countered, standing my ground for once. "His oncologist agrees." "What would you know about it?" Constance snapped. "We're trying to save our son." That night, as I helped David with his pain medication, he gripped my wrist with surprising strength. "They're afraid," he whispered, "not of losing me, of losing control." "What do you mean?" His eyes, sunken but still bright, held mine. "There's something I never told them, something I never told you either, but you'll find out soon enough." The last 3 months of David's life became a battleground. The Harringtons practically moved into our home, critiquing my care despite my nursing training. I'd find Constance rearranging David's medications or Richard discussing treatment options with doctors without including me. "We're bringing in a private nurse," Richard informed me over breakfast one morning. "I am a nurse," I reminded him, exhaustion seeping through my words. "A real nurse," Constance clarified, stirring her tea. "From Boston Memorial, someone who knows what they're doing." I looked to David, propped up in his wheelchair by the window, but he was gazing out at our small garden, seemingly lost in thought. He'd been withdrawing more each day, spending hours with his laptop when he had the strength, or on hushed phone calls that ended when I entered the room. One night, I found him awake at 3 a.m., frantically writing in a leather-bound journal. "What are you doing, love?" I asked, adjusting his blanket. "Making sure everything's in order." His smile was cryptic. "They think they know everything about me, but they don't. Not really." As October turned to November, hospice confirmed what I already knew. David had weeks, not months. The Harringtons organized a family dinner at our home, insisting on inviting their closest friends and relatives. "He should see everyone one last time," Constance said, though David was hardly strong enough to sit up for more than an hour. The evening of the dinner, our Cambridge townhouse filled with Boston's elite, surgeons in bespoke suits, women dripping in family heirlooms. David sat in his medical recliner in the living room, receiving people like a medieval king granting audiences. I noticed James and Audrey huddled with Richard in the kitchen, their voices low but intense. "Just making sure everything's arranged properly," James was saying. "The foundation, the lake house, everything." "And what about her?" Audrey asked, tilting her head in my direction. Richard's voice dropped lower. "We've discussed it. Once David's gone, we'll offer her a settlement, something reasonable to start fresh somewhere else." "She won't cause problems?" James pressed. "What leverage could she possibly have?" Richard scoffed. "She signed the prenup. She came with nothing. She'll leave with what's fair." I slipped away before they noticed me, heart hammering. They were already dividing David's assets, planning my exit while he still breathed in the next room. When I returned to David, Constance was perched beside him, showing him photos from his childhood sailing trips. "Remember how you always wanted to captain the boat? Even at 7, you were in charge," she cooed, as if speaking to a child. "Mom," David's voice was weak but clear, "where's Ellie?" "She's around somewhere," Constance waved dismissively. "Probably in the kitchen. You know she gets overwhelmed at these functions." "I need to speak with my wife," David insisted, suddenly looking directly at me. Constance's face tightened as she noticed me. "Of course, darling. I'll check on the caterers." When we were alone, David pulled me close, his breath shallow against my ear. "Tomorrow, I need you to call Sullivan, my attorney." "Is something wrong with the will?" I asked, confused. "Everything is exactly right with it," he replied with a strange smile. "Promise me something, Ellie. Promise me you'll be here, at the reading, no matter what they say or do." "Of course I'll be there," I assured him, stroking his thinning hair. "And promise me one more thing." His eyes burned with an intensity I hadn't seen in months. "When it happens, when Sullivan reads it, I want you to look at my father's face. Remember every detail. That's my last wish." Before I could ask what he meant, Constance returned with Richard in tow. "David needs rest," Richard announced to the room. "We should wrap this up." As guests began leaving, I overheard Audrey speaking with her cousin. "It's such a tragedy. David had such promise. And now, well, at least the family assets will be protected." David died 3 days later, holding my hand, that same mysterious smile on his face as he slipped away. 3 days after the funeral, we gathered at Sullivan and Partners' offices on Beacon Hill. The mahogany-paneled conference room felt suffocating as Sullivan, a silver-haired man with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, arranged his papers. The Harringtons sat across from me, their faces solemn but eyes calculating. Before we begin, Richard cleared his throat, I'd like to thank Eleanor for her care during David's illness. We know this is difficult for everyone. Sullivan nodded. Shall we proceed? Dr. Harrington left specific instructions about how this meeting should be conducted. He always was thorough, Constance murmured, dabbing at dry eyes. Sullivan opened a sealed envelope. First, Dr. Harrington requested that this video be played. A screen descended from the ceiling, and suddenly David's face filled it, gaunt but composed, clearly recorded weeks before his death. If you're watching this, I'm gone, his recorded self began. But before the legal details are addressed, there are truths that need to be spoken. The room stilled as David's eyes seemed to pierce through the screen. For 36 years, I've been the perfect son. Harvard Medical School, chief resident, published research. I became everything you wanted, Dad, but I've kept secrets too. Richard shifted uncomfortably. 3 years ago, David continued, I discovered something while reviewing genetic test results for a research study, an anomaly in my own DNA that didn't match our family's medical history. Curious, I ran more tests. The results were unequivocal. David's face hardened on screen. I am not biologically Richard Harrington's son. Constance gasped, her hand flying to her throat. Further testing confirmed that my biological father was Thomas Westfield. The name hung in the air. Thomas Westfield, Richard's former business partner who'd mysteriously left their practice decades ago. I confronted Mom, David continued. She admitted everything. How she and Thomas had an affair. How you suspected Dad but chose to raise me as your own to avoid scandal. How you systematically destroyed Thomas's medical career as punishment, forcing him to relocate to Minnesota. My breath caught. Minnesota? Yes, David nodded, as if anticipating our shock. Where 27 years later, his daughter would serve me coffee during my rotation at Mercy Hospital. His daughter, Eleanor Westfield. I felt the room spin. My father, my biological father, had never mentioned any connection to Boston. He died when I was 16, taking any secrets with him. The irony, David laughed bitterly on screen. You've spent years belittling my wife, claiming she wasn't good enough for our family, all while unknowingly rejecting your partner's daughter, my half-sister by blood. Richard turned ashen. This is preposterous, he whispered. I have DNA confirmation, David countered from beyond the grave. Ellie and I discovered our connection after we were already in love. We chose to keep it private, especially after learning how you ruined her father's career. Constance stood shakily. You can't possibly believe. The DNA doesn't lie, Mother. David's voice was ice. And neither do the letters from Thomas to you that I found in your safe, the ones begging to see his son. Sullivan paused the video as chaos erupted. James lunged across the table toward me. You knew? This whole time? You knew? I learned the truth 2 years ago, I said quietly, after David was diagnosed. This is a con, Audrey hissed. You manipulated him while he was ill. Enough, Sullivan's voice cut through. There's more. David's face reappeared. Because Ellie and I share a biological father, we couldn't legally marry in Massachusetts. Our wedding ceremony was symbolic, not legal. I watched the Harringtons' expressions shift from shock to calculated relief. If we weren't legally married, their precious prenup would protect them. However, David continued, as an unmarried individual with no legal spouse, I've had complete freedom to distribute my assets as I see fit. My personal fortune, including my patents, investments, and inheritance from my maternal grandmother, I leave entirely to the Westfield Foundation for Medical Education, with Eleanor Westfield as sole trustee. Richard slammed his fist on the table. "You can't do this!" "I already have, Dad," David smiled sadly. "The foundation will provide scholarships for underprivileged students entering medicine, starting with scholarships named after Thomas Westfield at the University of Minnesota. Everything is legally binding and already in motion." As the video ended, I remembered David's last wish. I looked directly at Richard's face, watching as decades of pride crumbled into humiliation and rage. I stood and gathered my purse. I think we're finished here. The aftermath was nuclear. As I left Sullivan's office, Richard's voice boomed behind me. "This isn't over. We'll contest everything." Sullivan calmly informed him that David had spent his final months ensuring the arrangements were legally ironclad. Dr. Harrington consulted with 5 separate law firms. The foundation was established 6 months ago, with assets already transferred. There's nothing to contest. In the weeks that followed, the Harringtons launched a 3-pronged attack. First came the legal assault. Teams of attorneys searching for loopholes in David's arrangements. Then came character assassination, whispers spreading through Boston society about the gold-digging nurse who had somehow manipulated their son. Finally came the personal confrontations. Constance appeared at my door one rainy afternoon, her normal composure fractured. "How much?" she demanded, stepping inside uninvited. "Excuse me?" "To walk away. Name your price." Her hand trembled as she opened her checkbook. I studied this woman who had belittled me for years, who had known all along that her husband had destroyed my father's career out of jealousy. "I'm not interested in your money, Constance." "Everyone has a price," she insisted, "especially people from backgrounds like yours." "People like me?" I echoed. "You mean your husband's partner's daughter? The man you had an affair with?" Color drained from her face. "You don't understand what it was like. Richard was cold, always working. Thomas actually saw me." "And then you let Richard destroy him," I said quietly. "Did you know my father never practiced medicine again? That he taught high school science in Rochester for barely enough to support us? That my mother worked 2 jobs after his death to keep our house?" Constance looked away. "Richard can be vindictive. So I've noticed." After she left, I received an unexpected visitor, James. Unlike his mother, he came with no checkbook, just a file folder. "I found these in Dad's study," he said, sliding it across my kitchen table. "Letters from your father to David. Dad intercepted them." Inside were a dozen envelopes addressed to David at various ages: 16th birthday, high school graduation, college acceptance. Never delivered. "He knew," I whispered. "My father knew about David." James nodded uncomfortably. "There's more. Dad didn't just force Thomas out. He threatened to report alleged prescription irregularities if Thomas ever contacted David. He manufactured evidence." "Why are you telling me this?" James stared into his coffee. "Because I've spent my life believing our family stood for something. Excellence, integrity. Now I discover we're built on lies." The foundation became my focus. I established the Thomas Westfield Scholarship for first-generation medical students, using David's research patents and investment portfolio, worth considerably more than the Harringtons had realized. David had been quietly brilliant with investments, multiplying his inheritance through tech startups and medical innovations. 3 months after the will reading, Audrey contacted me. Unlike her mother and brother, she came with neither money nor revelations. "I need to understand," she said simply. Who was he, really? My brother, or I guess my half-brother? We met regularly after that. I shared stories of the David she hadn't known, the one who left poetry books for hospital janitors, who volunteered at a free clinic in Dorchester without telling his family. She shared childhood memories I treasured, filling gaps in my understanding of his early life. Through Audrey, I also learned that Richard had suffered a minor stroke, forcing his retirement from surgery. The Harrington name, once medical royalty in Boston, was tarnished by whispers of the scandal. 6 months after David's death, I received a package from Sullivan. Inside was David's journal, the one he'd written in during those late nights. "My dearest Ellie," his final entry read, "by now you know everything. When I discovered our connection, I was afraid it would destroy what we had. Then I realized it explained so much, how we understood each other from the beginning, how we felt like family before we were family. Finding you was the miracle in my tragedy. I'm sorry for the pain this revelation brings, but not for the truth it reveals. The Harringtons built their legacy on appearances and control. Build yours on compassion and truth. That will be my real legacy." The unexpected twist came a year after David's death. While organizing a fundraiser for the foundation, I met Robert, a childhood friend of David's I'd never known. He brought photos of them as teenagers, sailing off Cape Cod. "David called me, Robert said, 2 weeks before he died, asked me to look out for you, said you'd be running his foundation." "That sounds like him," I smiled sadly. "He also said something odd, that you'd probably need someone who understood the Harrington world but wasn't poisoned by it. That's why I offered to help with donor relations. Robert became my guide through Boston's elite circles, helping transform the foundation into a respected institution. The Harringtons watched from a distance as their son's legacy grew without their involvement. The final piece fell into place 18 months after David's death. Sullivan called to inform me that the old Harrington Lake House in New Hampshire, the one place David had found peace as a child, had been quietly transferred to the foundation before his death. He left instructions that it should be used as a retreat for scholarship recipients, Sullivan explained. When I visited the property, I found David's last message, a letter sealed in his desk drawer. "The lake house was my sanctuary," he'd written. "The one place I could be myself, away from expectations. I want it to be that for others now. And for you, Ellie, whenever you need to remember that family is what we create, not what we're born into." It's been 3 years since I stood in that cemetery, watching rain pelt David's casket. The Westfield Foundation now supports 20 medical students annually, each one carrying forward a legacy built on truth rather than appearances. Last month, our first scholarship recipient graduated from Harvard Medical School, the same institution where David once walked. Richard Harrington never spoke to me again. He and Constance divorced last year, their perfect facade finally crumbling under the weight of decades of lies. Audrey works with me now, heading our mentorship program. James left Boston entirely, finding his own path away from his father's shadow. As for me, I've learned that family isn't defined by blood or status, but by the people who see your true worth. David and I may have shared a father, but what bound us was something deeper, a recognition of each other's souls that transcended convention. Sometimes I visit the lake house alone, sitting on the dock where David spent his childhood summers, and I feel at peace. Not because I won some battle against the Harringtons, but because the truth finally broke free after decades buried in silence. If you're facing your own family struggles or feeling like an outsider in someone else's story, remember this. You belong wherever you choose to create belonging. Your worth isn't determined by those who reject you, but by the truth you carry within. Thank you for listening to my story. If it resonated with you, please like this video and subscribe to hear more stories of truth prevailing against all odds.